Thank you. I'll be talking about an endangered plant called Mount Compass oak bush, but I need to point out that this is work that was largely done by my predecessor, Joe Quamby. He started 6 years ago on it, and also Kylie Moritz. Mount Compass oak bush is Allocationina robusta, is listed as endangered under the EPBC Act and also the National Parks and Wildlife Act. And the reason why it's listed is it's due to its highly restricted distribution. 172 square kilometres has been estimated. The fact that populations are small and declining. The fact that it's endemic to Flora Peninsula in the vicinity of Mount Compass. And it's confined to wet heath and eucalypt woodlands at the margins of swamps and watercourses. And you probably know that particularly wet heath type communities, particularly the swamp communities in Flora Peninsula are endangered communities. And riparian vegetation is very heavily weed invaded. So it occurs confined to a pretty threatened habitat type. This shows the distribution of the species. The pointer on this. You can see this yellow area shows the full extent of where it used to occur, and these red areas are where it survives, which are largely on roadsides. So when Joe Quamby did his initial action plan for the species back in 2011, he only found 31 subpopulations of the species, totalling 1,200 plants, with the majority of populations having less than 20 plants, and only 8 populations having more than 50 plants. So a very fragmented situation. And where it was occurring, there was multiple of threats. Main threat being habitat loss and fragmentation, but weeds are a major thing. It's occurring in areas which are quite damp, so Fleurieu is a major problem, along with Genista. But also livestock grazing or browsing. Where it occurs on roadsides, the road verges are quite narrow, and often the stock can poke their head through the fence and eat it, and they just love eating it. Also, kangaroos are a major problem, as I'll talk about later. And a major problem is, because of the weed invasion and the browsing, there's very limited seedling recruitment. There's no seedlings coming up at all pretty well. This shows a typical roadside population, and 97% of populations confined to roadsides were on roadsides, where they're threatened by particularly weed invasion. You can see Fleurieu here. Roadworks, you can see how narrow that verge is where it's occurring, and also where there's weeds, there's herbicide spraying, and that's often a threat as well. And as I said, cows sticking their heads through fences and eating it. So in 2011, Joe wrote an action plan, as I mentioned, and he worked out some priority actions for the species, particularly seed collection and storage, establishment or re-establishment of larger populations in reserves, translocation into existing populations, and importantly, a program of public awareness to get the local people down there aware of the significance of this species and get them involved in the recovery. Also a program of setting up roadside markers, and of course weed control is a big thing, and in particular having a recovery team which involved all the stakeholders, including local people, set up. Okay, in terms of weed management, in the last 6 years, quite a bit has happened there. And particularly they've been focusing on priority sites with large numbers of plants. So the 7 sites which they've targeted for weed control have contained over 40% of all the remnant plants. Also there's been extensive weed control, and it's ongoing in Stippa Tourist Conservation Park, which has about 60-65 plants surviving there. And also that's where a major part of our translocation program is happening, but also there's been work on weed control at other translocation sites. To get weed weed control has occurred on roadsides, but also in reserves, and it's been done on areas which are managed by both the Alexandrina and Victor Harbour councils, also Department of Transport and Energy and Infrastructure roadsides. And this work has been done by particularly the group I work for, Natural Resources, AMLR, and also Murray-Darling Basin, but also volunteer groups like the Fret and Plant Action Group, Trees for Life, the Gawler Wellington LAP Group, and the council has been involved as well, as has DTI. So translocations, how much translocations happen? Well, this has been a great success story. Due to having broad numbers of people involved in it, including the something I'll talk about later, Swamp Fest, where it gets held once a year down at Stipatourus. 6,800 plants, chief stock plants of Alocasarina robusta has been planted out, including 2,700 into Duna reserves, Stipatourus and Hesperilla Conservation Park, 1,400 on private land, 1,500 on roadsides, and then council land, and also in a school and scout reserve. And this shows Swamp Fest, where every year up to close on 100 volunteers have been coming out since 2012 for the day and planting out not only Alocasarina but lots of those as well. And as a result, 2,000 have been planted out in Stipatourus Conservation Park, and you can see the guards they put up around it. This top photo shows the impact of kangaroos. You can see how they've been browsing off the plants sticking above the tree guard. So every plant has had to be protected with either these tree guards or with netting, and there's also been small exclosures of netting put up as well to protect the plants. The thing that hadn't been done up to the time that I took on the job, September last year, was actually working out how many of these plants had actually survived. So a big emphasis has been in this year doing surveys of these translocated plants to see survival rates. And that's involved a number of volunteers, and also down the bottom there's Colin Moritz from Murray-Darling Basin AMLR, and on the bottom right is Tim Jury from Fret and Plant Action Group, and there's been other volunteers as well. And the result of those surveys is that of the remnant plants, and we looked at 88% of the plants that existed in 2011, there's been no increase or no decrease, so no great recruitment, but there hasn't declined as well. In terms of translocated plants, and again we looked at the majority, 74% of plants that were planted out. Over 2,000 of these plants, or 40% of them, have survived, and some of them are actually got to the stage where they're actually fruiting now. Particular success has been in Stipatourus Conservation Park. Somewhere between 65 plants were in existence in 2011. Now those plants are still not recruiting, but through the Swamp Fest, the 2,000 plants that were planted out, we have 900 plants surviving by 2016. Another part of the recovery project has been seed storage, and in 2011 all 32 remnant populations were visited, and fruit was taken from every plant and every population, and this has been stored in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens in the South Australian Seed Conservation Centre, where they've dried it, tested its viability and stored it. And these are the seeds, part of these seeds were stored, but the other part of these seeds were actually used for the translocation trials. So the translocation trials have been using genetic material from right across the whole range of the species, and also there was in the part of the action plan was to work out where seed from a particular population was going to be translocated to. So that was very carefully worked out to make sure that stuff wasn't translocated to greater distance. Also some genetic work was done at the time, which showed that the genetic diversity in the population wasn't that much less than in more common species, so that was not really a problem. Challenges. There is some challenges, and particularly kangaroos. This shows Meadows Creek Council Reserve, which has over 130 plants in there, still remnant plants, and they've planted a lot of the ones out there. I visited it only a month ago, and there was massive browsing by kangaroos. And the solution is not just putting guards up. Really, we need to, with these larger populations, particularly this heritage agreement area, and also in steppe tourists, there need to be some sort of culling program. So that's a challenge for the future, reducing kangaroo numbers. That's a problem in lots of areas of native vegetation in the Flora Peninsula. And the other problem is how do we manage the native vegetation containing remnant plants to promote natural regeneration? And this photo shows me in the natural population, the remnant population in Steppe Tourist Conservation Park, where there's something like 60, 65 plants. They're old plants, they've got fruit on it, lots of fruit, but there's no young ones coming up. The vegetation is very dense, and these plants will ultimately senesce. Now, the big question is, while the plants are alive, the seed remains in the cone. If a fire goes through at that stage, then the plants will probably die and the seed will fall out onto the bare ground and regenerate. But if you allow these plants to senesce, once the plants die, the branches die, the seeds drop to the ground. We don't know how long that seed lasts on the ground and how it will react to a fire. So there's a big area that needs to be looked at. That applies to all the populations, not just the remnant plants, but also the translocated plants. We don't be in a situation where we just keep planting stuff back. We need to get some natural regeneration, and that requires a little bit of research. So, conclusion, translocations addressed a number of the criteria under which Mount Compass Oak Bush was listed as endangered under the UPBC Act. So, from 1,200 plants through translocation, numbers have been increased to 3,000 plants. 31 populations have been increased to over 40 populations by planting new populations on private land. Also, the action plan had a number of recovery objectives and performance criteria, and we've addressed those as well. So by 2016, which is the date mentioned in the action plan, the action plan suggested that no further losses of population should occur by that time. Well, we've achieved that. The action plan milestone stipulated that there should be at least 75% population increase in size, and we've achieved 150%. So big tick there as well. We've increased the total number of plants to 3,000, which is more than what was the threshold was for the action plan. There's 9 new populations, and the seed storage has been achieved at the South Australian Seed Conservation Centre in the Botanic Gardens. Habitat improvement has occurred at more than 8 sites, priority sites, so that's another tick for the performance criteria in the action plan. All the roadside populations have been marked, and there's been new protection of populations via heritage agreements. So there's Meadows Creek Council Reserve is now protected under a heritage agreement, as is some private land at Blackfellows Creek. So 2 new heritage agreements. And importantly, the community has been involved. Not just the community, but the local and state government as well. There's been plantings on private land. There's Swamp Fest, which I talked about before, involving I think this year they're predicted to have over 90 people coming over that day planting. So all these people get to know about the plant, and also the Victor Harbour and Alexandrina councils. This has all been achieved in 6 years. However, it's important to note that this is not every threatened species can have recovery occurring at such a fast rate, and people previously today have talked about the problem of orchids, and orchids is a classic example of a species which is difficult to recover. A bit more like when you look at these bird recovery plans and mammal recovery plans, orchids are equally problematic because of complicated mycorrhizal fungi and pollination interactions and cryptic environmental factors required to break dormancy. So there are other species which will take a lot longer to recover and take a lot more money. I'd like to thank all these people who helped the project get where it got. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rick. That's excellent. Sorry, again, we won't have time for questions. The last speaker, lucky last.
But certainly not least.
No, definitely not least. David